Picture a city of 500,000 people, towering pyramids, palaces, marketplaces, canals carrying drinking water, observatories where priests tracked the movements of Venus down to the day. Now picture that city simply disappearing. Not over a decade, within a single generation. People wake up one morning, go out to their fields, and within a few years the site of what was once the largest metropolis in the Americas is nothing but jungle slowly swallowing the stone steps of its temples. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of Tikal, Copan, Palenque, dozens of Maya cities that, at their peak, were larger than London or Paris of their era. And then, over the course of roughly 100 to 200 years, they emptied out. Where did millions of people go? Why did they abandon the most advanced civilization in Mesoamerica? And why did the jungle keep the answer hidden for over 1,000 years, until satellites with lasers started scanning the forest from above? Today we're going to figure out what actually happened to the Maya cities. Before we talk about the fall, we need to understand just how extraordinary the rise was. The Maya weren't a single empire with one ruler, like Rome or Egypt. They were a network of dozens of independent city-states scattered across what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Each city had its own king and a jaw, its own dynasty, its own army, and its own ambitions to conquer its neighbors. This civilization's golden age falls within what's called the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE. During this time, the Maya built cities with populations in the tens and hundreds of thousands. At its peak, archaeologists estimate Tikal held more than 60,000 people in its core alone, with hundreds of thousands more across the surrounding area. And these were not primitive settlements scattered through the jungle. The Maya had a writing system, the only complete writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, used to record dynastic history, wars, and astronomical observations. Mathematics with the concept of zero, long before it took hold in Europe. A calendar system so precise that Maya predictions of solar eclipses were accurate to within seconds, projected centuries in advance. Sophisticated hydraulic engineering, reservoirs, canals, and water filtration systems in a region with no major rivers. Monumental architecture, pyramids as tall as 20-story buildings, built without metal tools and without the wheel as a means of transport. This was a civilization at the height of its power. And that's exactly why its collapse is so shocking to archaeologists. There was no obvious external enemy who conquered it and burned it to the ground. The Maya didn't get conquered. They simply stopped building. And then they stopped living where they had built. Archaeologists call this event the Classic Maya Collapse. And its traces were first noticed back in the 19th century, when traveling researchers pushed through the Guatemalan jungle and stumbled onto stone pyramids consumed by tree roots. Local residents living just a few kilometers away often had no idea the ruins were even there. The key evidence for the decline comes from so-called stele, stone monuments that Maya kings erected regularly to record important dates, victories, and rituals. This was a practice that had continued for centuries, almost like a ruler's annual report. And here's the strange part. In the southern lowland cities, Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Caracol, the dated inscriptions on these stele simply stop. The last monument at Copan is dated to 822. At Tikal, it's 869. Kings stopped keeping records. Construction of new temples halted mid-build. In some places, archaeologists have found unfinished structures, as if workers had suddenly dropped their tools and walked away. Based on estimates from dwellings and burial counts, Population dropped by 90 to 99% over roughly 100 years in the central lowland regions. This is one of the sharpest demographic collapses in human history, comparable only to the aftermath of the worst epidemics or genocides, except here there were no conquerors and no documented disease. Most importantly, the collapse wasn't simultaneous. It rolled through like a wave. First, the western and central cities declined, then the southeastern ones, and only decades later did it reach the northern cities of the Yucatan, such as Chichen Itza, which, notably, went on thriving for a long time and even experienced a new golden age after the southern megacities had already emptied out. That's the first important clue. The cause couldn't have been a single, instantaneous catastrophe like an earthquake or one war. Something drawn out over time and uneven across geography was dismantling the civilization systematically. Before we move on to the theories, there's one important thing worth mentioning. For almost 400 years, these cities were considered legend rather than historical fact. When the Spanish conquered Mesoamerica in the 16th century, they encountered only scattered groups of Maya farmers living in small settlements. People who had no idea that a few days' journey through the jungle lay the ruins of their ancestors' megacities. Rumors of enormous stone pyramids circulated only among local hunters. It wasn't until 1839 that American diplomat and traveler John Lloyd Stephens, together with English artist Frederick Catherwood, set out on an expedition through Central America to check out rumors of a lost city in the jungle. They hired guides, spent weeks hacking through impenetrable brush, and stumbled upon Copan, a city completely swallowed by the forest, where tree roots split apart stone stelae and moss-covered faces of ancient kings stared out through the leaves. Stephens wrote at the time that he stood before proof of a civilization no less advanced than Egypt or Greece, one that virtually no one in the civilized world of his day knew anything about. Catherwood produced detailed drawings of the ruins, later published in a 2-volume set that became a sensation across Europe and America. This expedition effectively discovered the Maya for Western science, even though the Maya themselves, of course, had never gone anywhere. Their descendants had been living just a few kilometers from these forgotten pyramids the entire time. But here's the key part. Even after discovering the cities, scholars still couldn't read the inscriptions on the stelae for nearly 100 years. Maya hieroglyphs were thought to be indecipherable ornamentation, the key to cracking the code, and, as a result, the key to understanding the collapse itself, wasn't found until the second half of the 20th century. And that story is worth telling too. The most paradoxical part of the story of decoding Maya writing is that the crucial breakthrough wasn't made by a field archaeologist. It was made by a young Soviet linguist, Yuri Norizov, a man who, at the time of his most important discoveries in the 1950s, had never once set foot in Mexico or Guatemala, and had little realistic chance of doing so given the conditions of the Cold War. Working in Leningrad from photocopies of 3 surviving medieval Maya manuscripts, the few that survived mass destruction by Spanish missionaries, Norizov proposed a bold hypothesis. Maya hieroglyphs weren't standalone picture symbols representing whole words, as Western researchers had long assumed, but rather a phonetic system in which signs represented syllables, similar to Japanese kana. This hunch turned out to be correct, and it effectively unlocked a door that had been sealed for decades. Thanks to this approach, researchers over the following decades were able to read thousands of inscriptions on stelae, pottery, and palace walls, and suddenly the Maya were speaking in their own voice. It turned out these weren't faceless, priests worshipping incomprehensible gods, but specific kings with names, titles, lineages, victories, defeats, marriage alliances, and personal ambitions. It was thanks to this decipherment that archaeologists were able to pin down the exact dates of the last monuments at Köppen and Tikal, trace the chronology of wars between city-states, and reconstruct, almost year by year, exactly how the wave of collapse rolled across Maya territory. Without this breakthrough, today's entire account of the Maya collapse would look far more washed out. We'd be talking about faceless ruins rather than specific rulers who, the last time they ordered their title carved into stone, had no idea it would be the final entry in their dynasty's history. The most popular and best supported theory today is the climate theory, and the evidence behind it is genuinely striking. The region where the Maya lived is a limestone plateau with no major rivers. All drinking water depended on seasonal rains and underground water sources called cenotes. That means Maya civilization was catastrophically vulnerable to even small shifts in climate. Scientists reconstruct past climate using cave stalagmites and lake bottom sediments. Layer by layer, year by year, stone and mud preserve chemical fingerprints of how much rain fell in a given season. A study by a University of Cambridge team, based on a stalagmite from a cave in Mexico's Yucatan, produced a remarkably detailed picture during the so-called Terminal Classic period, roughly 871 to 1021. The region endured at least 8 prolonged droughts, each lasting 3 years or more. One of them, and this figure is staggering, lasted a full 13 years without a normal rainy season. Picture that, 13 years in which crops regularly fail, reservoirs dry up, and the rain doesn't come again the following year either. For a society feeding hundreds of thousands of people through intensive agriculture pushed to the limits of its ecosystem, that's a fatal blow. And what's especially compelling is that these drought periods line up chronologically with the halt in monument construction at Chichen Itza and other cities in exactly the years when, according to the stalagmite data, the rains failed. This isn't just a coincidence within the span of a century. It's a match down to specific years. The logic of collapse runs like this. Drought failed harvests, famine weakened royal authority. Since a king's legitimacy rested on his promise of proper relations with the rain gods, social unrest, elites abandoning major building projects, population migrating in search of water and food, the eventual emptying of cities. Researchers also point out that the Maya didn't just sit and wait. Archaeological excavations show sophisticated water storage and management systems at terminal classic sites. People tried to adapt, building additional reservoirs and changing farming techniques. But once droughts became too frequent and too long, these mechanisms simply stopped being enough. And when familiar survival strategies fail at the same time as famine sets in, a society enters what researchers call a lethal risk spiral. Trust in authority and social cohesion collapse at exactly the moment they're needed most. Tellingly, more centralized cities with broader trade networks, like Chichen Itza, held on longer. They could offset a local bad harvest through connections with other regions. This is worth pausing on, because it's where things get really interesting. Science isn't about landing on one neat answer. It's about constantly testing theories. And in 2025 to 2026, a study emerged that significantly complicated the picture. A team from the University of Montreal, led by geographer Benjamin Gwyneth, analyzed bottom sediments from Lake Itsen in Guatemala, sediment cores 3,300 years old, containing a detailed climate record for the exact region where the city of Itzen is located. The result was unexpected. They found no traces of drought there during the period of decline. Because of its geography, proximity to the Cordillera mountain range, this region kept receiving steady rainfall from the Caribbean even while neighboring territories were already suffering through drought. And yet the city of Itzen collapsed too, at roughly the same time as the drought-stricken regions. That tells us one thing: drought can't be the single, universal explanation. If a city with no drought fell in the same way as cities that did experience drought, then there's at least one other factor at play, or several factors acting together. This brings us to the other theories, which archaeologists treat not as competitors to the climate theory, but as pieces of the same larger picture. The Maya fought each other constantly. But in the final decades of the Classic period, the intensity and brutality of these conflicts spiked sharply. The decipherment of hieroglyphic inscriptions in the second half of the 20th century, incidentally, the story of cracking Maya writing is its own fascinating detective story, revealed that these weren't ritual skirmishes but genuine, grinding wars over resources, trade routes, and political dominance. Cities like Karakol and Calakmul waged years-long campaigns against Tikal, wiping out rival dynasties. Archaeologists find a rise in the number of fortifications, ditches, and stone walls surrounding cities in exactly the final decades before the collapse, clear evidence that security had become the elite's top concern. In some sites, researchers have found signs of mass graves and destruction consistent with military violence rather than natural causes. The logical link to the climate theory is direct. When resources shrink due to drought, competition over them intensifies, and war follows. In other words, drought and warfare aren't two separate, competing explanations. They're two links in the same chain. Climate undermines the economy, conflict over land and water intensifies, war finishes off the destruction that nature started. Researchers at UC Santa Barbara, led by Douglas Kinnett, state plainly in a recent study that the very rise and subsequent fall of classic Maya cities is explained not by a single factor, but by the interaction of climate downturns, intergroup conflict, and powerful economies of scale that emerged from investment in agricultural infrastructure. In simple terms, the same system that allowed the Maya to grow so large, intensive agriculture, trade, centralized power, was the very thing that made them fragile once climate and political stability wavered at the same time. Case study: the century-long war between Tikal and Calakmul. To make this theory less abstract, let's look at a specific example, a conflict archaeologists sometimes call the Maya World War. Tikal and Calakmul, the two most powerful city-states of the Maya lowlands, waged a grinding struggle for regional supremacy that lasted nearly a century and a half. This wasn't a simple border feud. Calakmul wove together a complex web of alliances with smaller cities around Tikal, effectively surrounding its rival politically and, eventually, militarily. In 562, Calakmul inflicted a crushing defeat on Tikal, after which Tikal's inscriptions fall silent for almost 130 years. The defeated king apparently didn't even dare carve a record of it, and his successors, by all appearances, were mired in a deep political crisis, unable to resume the rituals that immortalized their own authority. Tikal only recovered at the end of the 7th century, when a new king, Jasa Chankawilai, defeated Calakmul in turn and restored the city's status as the region's superpower. But the cost of this century-long standoff was enormous. Both cities poured resources, labor, and harvests not into growth, but into armies, fortifications, and support for allies in a war of attrition. And it was precisely these war-drained cities that turned out least prepared to survive the series of droughts that began a generation later. By the time the climate delivered its blow, there was no reserve of resilience left in the treasury. It had been eaten up by decades of armed rivalry for a supremacy that, in the end, no one held on to for good. There's another factor that rarely makes the headlines, but is backed by solid evidence: the destruction of the Maya's own environment. To feed millions of people, the Maya cleared forest for farmland on a massive scale. Pollen analysis from lake bottom sediments shows a sharp decline in forest cover in precisely the final centuries before the collapse. And forest loss triggers a chain reaction. Fewer trees, less moisture evaporation, less local rainfall, soil erosion, depletion of fertile topsoil, falling crop yields. In other words, the Maya partly prepared the ground themselves, quite literally, for drought to hit even harder than it would have in an untouched forest landscape. Add to this overpopulation. By the 9th century, population density in some regions of the Maya lowlands was comparable to densely populated agricultural regions of the modern world. The land simply couldn't feed that many people without a stable climate and healthy ecosystems. And by the end of the Classic period, both of those had been undermined. Now, let's talk about what turned Maya archaeology upside down over the past decade. For years, the jungles of Guatemala, Mexico, and Belize were considered nearly impossible to survey fully. Dense vegetation hid the ruins, and on-foot surveys could take years to cover just a few square kilometers. Everything changed with LiDAR, laser scanning from a plane or drone that penetrates the forest canopy and builds a detailed 3D map of the ground surface underneath the trees. In 2018, a massive LiDAR survey of more than 2,100 square kilometers of northern Guatemala revealed something nobody expected: more than 60,000 previously unknown structures, homes, palaces, roads, defensive fortifications, irrigation canals. It turned out the region's population had been far larger than previously believed, and cities were connected by a complex road network. The Maya, in effect, had developed infrastructure comparable to some ancient civilizations of the Old World. This discovery forced archaeologists to significantly revise population estimates upward, which means the scale of the demographic collapse turned out to be even more dramatic than previously thought. Where earlier estimates spoke of millions of people in the Maya region at its peak, the new data pushes that number to 10 million or more. LiDAR also confirmed the overpopulation and intensive agriculture theory. The scans revealed terraced fields, canals, and dams covering literally every scrap of usable land. Evidence of a society operating at the very edge of its ecosystem's capacity, with no margin of safety for a crisis. And here's another fact that breaks the stereotype of a vanished civilization. When the Spanish conquered most of Maya territory back in the 16th century, one kingdom continued to exist independently. In the middle of Lake Petén, in what is now Guatemala, Najpatan, capital of the Itzá kingdom. Surrounded by water and hard to reach through the jungle, this city-state avoided conquest for more than a century after the rest of Mesoamerica had fallen. Spanish missionaries and conquistadors made several attempts to subdue Najpatan, both diplomatically and by force, and failed every time. The last Itzá king, Ajak and Ek, received Spanish envoys, listened to their offers to convert and submit to the crown, and refused each time, citing prophecies from the Maya calendar that indicated it was not yet the proper moment for such a change. It wasn't until 1697, a date not so far removed from the era of Peter I in Ukraine and Russia that a Spanish army finally stormed and captured Najbatan. This was, without exaggeration, the last independent indigenous state on the American mainland to be conquered by Europeans. In other words, the heirs of classic Maya civilization, albeit on a much smaller scale, continued living in their own state, with their own kings and religion, for almost 800 years after Tikal and Calakmul had already emptied out. This fact matters for understanding the full story. The collapse of the 9th century destroyed a specific model, a network of giant monumental megacities. But the people themselves, their language, their beliefs, and even their statehood on a smaller scale endured for centuries afterward. If you pull all the clues together, modern archaeology doesn't offer one simple answer. It offers a perfect storm model, several factors stacking on top of each other at once. The civilization grew to the very edge of what its ecosystem could support: deforestation, overpopulation, soil pushed to exhaustion. This fragile system was hit by a series of prolonged droughts, not a single catastrophe, but repeated blows over decades. A system already weakened by drought and famine collided with intensifying wars over resources between city-states. The political legitimacy of kings, which rested on their supposed magical control over rain and harvests, collapsed once their promises to the gods stopped delivering. People began to migrate. They didn't vanish without a trace, but relocated en masse to wherever water and safety could still be found, often north into the Yucatan, where some cities, like Chichen Itza, kept thriving long after their southern neighbors had fallen. The most important thing to remember: the Maya did not disappear. Their descendants, millions of people, still live today in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, speaking languages of the Mayan family and preserving parts of their traditions. What vanished wasn't a people, but a specific model of civilization, a network of enormous monumental city-states ruled by divine kings. When that model proved unsustainable under climate and social pressure, people adapted in a different way. They scattered, moved into smaller settlements, and changed how they live. Here's something interesting. The Maya are far from the only advanced civilization to fall along roughly this same climate plus system overstretch pattern. Around the same period when the southern Maya lowlands emptied out, the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, with its magnificent capital at Angkor, was going through its own crisis, and researchers likewise find evidence of prolonged droughts interspersed with floods that crippled the complex irrigation system on which the survival of that million-person city depended. Even earlier, roughly 1,000 years before the Maya, one of the world's first great urban civilizations fell, the Indus Valley Civilization, and recent climate reconstructions likewise point to a series of multi-year droughts as one of the key factors in its decline. Even the Western Roman Empire, whose fall is traditionally explained by barbarian invasions, shows signs, according to modern climate research, of cooling and unstable rainfall in exactly its final decades, which undermined harvests and, as a result, the empire's ability to maintain its army and administration. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't just a trend among modern archaeologists to blame climate for everything. It's a pattern: complex societies that grow to the very limits of what their ecosystem can support, and that depend on a narrow band of stable conditions. Exactly this much rainfall, exactly this much harvest, exactly this level of trade, have a far smaller margin of resilience when those conditions suddenly shift. The more complex and centralized a system is, the more painfully it reacts to what might look on the surface, like a moderate change in external conditions. The Maya story is especially valuable because, thanks to their writing system, their stele, and their precise dates, we can see this process play out in rare detail, year by year, city by city, whereas for most other ancient civilizations, the picture is far blurrier. The story of the Maya isn't just a mystery from the past. It's arguably the best documented example in the ancient world of how a complex, technologically advanced civilization can collapse, not because of barbarians at the gates, but through a combination of climate instability, resource exhaustion, and political fragility. When a system built to thrive in good times has no reserve of resilience for bad ones. What's more, the Maya were not primitive or uneducated. They had astronomers who calculated planetary movements centuries in advance, engineers who built reservoirs in an arid region, and scribes who kept detailed records. And still, the system couldn't withstand the accumulated blows. Today, archaeologists armed with LiDAR scanners and stalagmite analysis are piecing this history back together drop by drop, and every new study adds another piece to the puzzle, and sometimes, as with Lakeitson, forces a rethink of conclusions that once seemed settled. The jungles of Guatemala are still hiding hundreds, perhaps thousands, of unidentified structures. Who knows what other answers are still waiting under the layers of roots and leaves? If you found this interesting, hit like and subscribe. There are plenty more stories on this channel about civilizations that vanished in equally mysterious ways. And let me know in the comments, which theory of the Maya collapse do you find most convincing?